Welcome to Fear Street.
I've been working at this tiny mall in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, for the last 4 years. 2 of those years, I was working as a custodian part-time while working at Taco Time. Now, I work as a security guard, and of the 3 days I work, I do 2 graveyard shifts. These happenings are just too strange to discard as an overactive imagination. My first experience was while working the closing shift as a custodian. I was finishing up the last 15 minutes before clocking out at midnight. No one worked graveyard security at the time because the mall was owned by GGP, so I was completely by myself. I decided I'd hustle in vacuuming the entrance rugs, as well as the rugs in the corridors. I'd all but finished every rug except for one in the corridor by Macy's. The one corridor that has an antique shop neighbored by the exit. I opened the corridor double doors to see that one of the fluorescent lights was out at the end of the corridor. The whole rest of the corridor was lit up well enough, so I didn't think twice about anything unusual. I walked all the way down towards the end and became aware that the end of the corridor was pitch black. I couldn't even make out the wall, even though there was plenty of light from the other fluorescent lights behind me. Suddenly, as I approached the rugs in the darkness, I felt this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't wanted there. It was so overwhelming, and the feeling came so quickly, I instantly fled from the dark void. I didn't even look back as I shut the entrance doors. After that incident, I decided firmly that the mall had an entity haunting it. I've had enough unexplained events beforehand to know that an overwhelming feeling flooding into my conscious mind was more than a wild imagination. The second thing that happened wasn't particularly big. I was working the closing shift at Taco Time and was just sitting back there as usual, waiting for time to pass because we never had many customers towards the end of a weekday night. I was listening to music and sitting next to the fridge when, out of the blue, the fridge door opened by itself. From my experiences, that fridge door never had a problem staying shut, and its seals were in perfect condition. I just sat there looking at it and said out loud, "Could you shut that when you're finished?" I think I even said thank you. I shut the fridge and moved on to closing, shaking my head all the while. The third event happened last week on my graveyard shift, down the same corridor that my first experience happened. All my graveyard shifts had seemed to go by without any incident. I had accepted that there was an entity in the building, maybe more than one. I felt like I was being watched every shift, but nothing ever seemed to happen until last week. I was on my second run around the building at about 3 a.m. I made it to the Macy corridor, and the second I opened the double doors, that feeling overwhelmed me once again. I could hear a soft humming, almost like a distant vehicle idling. I stopped and listened for a moment, trying to figure out why I was hearing such a strange noise at that time of night. I moved down the hallway towards the exit and entrance doors to hit my button, and that was when the feeling washed over me even harder. I knew I wasn't wanted there. The humming had dissipated and all was silent. I was just about to hit the button when a loud clang sounded from nowhere. I screamed angrily, furious that something was actually messing with me so effectively. My whole body tingled in fear, yet my adrenaline kept me from running. I hit the button and stomped out of the corridor, feeling as if a giant maw was going to swallow me whole. I've had plenty of experience with unexplained events, but this recent one really got to me. I feel like something is slowly working into my mind and playing off my deepest fears. I have to go back tonight for another graveyard shift, and I really don't want to. So about 15 years ago, I was living in the high desert of Los Angeles County, going to college full-time and working 2 jobs. One job was working security at night for a church with a large campus that had a private school on the property. The property had entrances on the west and north sides. At night, we would close the gate on the north side and post a guy in a car to deter break-ins and direct any traffic to the main entrance. On the north side of the property, there were modular trailer buildings that were bought secondhand and used as classroom space. One of these buildings was the trouble source. Whenever I was stationed at the back entrance, I would get this strong feeling that I was being watched. I'm talking hair standing on end, goosebumps, and paranoia. I was being watched and I was not welcome. I wasn't the only one who experienced these feelings. It was most of the crew. Eventually, we got scientific about it. Whenever there was a new guy, we'd stick him back there for his first night and not say anything. A few hours later, we'd roll by to check on him, and the new guy would be getting really jumpy, or he would have moved the chair out of the line of sight of the building. Part of the job was making sure the doors of all the buildings were locked, and if they weren't, we'd have to check the building and make sure nobody was squatting. This particular building would have lights come on and flicker in the middle of the night. Chairs and desks would be moderately moved around in classrooms. There would also be chairs pulled out and that kind of thing. One night when I was back there, the building had been locked, but when I checked it later, it wasn't. I was thinking, great, now I've got to go in. By now my skin was crawling and I could tell whatever was in there was pissed. I radioed in a second guy and we went inside. Upon entering the building, we quickly swept through with flashlights and cleared all the rooms. We didn't see a thing. We made our way back to the front door. As we were standing by the entrance, there was a loud, noticeable floor creak, like somebody took a step, though the room was empty. Then, a sound I can only describe as blowing air or wind quickly moved above the ceiling tiles from that classroom towards us. When it got right above us, it stopped, dead silent. This wasn't the AC system. The duct system wasn't in that part of the ceiling, and it was shut off. We never ran so fast in our lives. I'm not saying it was a ghost or a spirit or whatever. All I know is that something was in that building, and it felt evil. I've been working for the past 4 years at Lake Compounce, an amusement park in Bristol, Connecticut. This park is widely regarded as the oldest amusement park in the United States. I've worked numerous third shifts in the off-season, where I'm the only living soul in the park until about 8 a.m. And boy, have I experienced some weird things. There have been multiple deaths at the park, both employees and guests, 2 of which I was present at as a first responder in the park. Many guards, including myself, refused to patrol specific areas of the park. More specifically, the famous Starlight Theater, where many famous musicians had their careers start, Frank Sinatra being one of them. One night while patrolling the park in January at around 3 a.m., I was walking past the ballroom and the lights were off and the doors locked. As I turned the corner to go to the other side of the park, I looked back, and all of the lights were on, and the side door was open. Nobody was in the park besides me. I immediately went back to our building and remained there for the rest of my shift. Another night, I went into our administration building to use the bathroom. As I was finishing up, I heard footsteps and doors opening and closing. Once again, I immediately went back into our security building and stayed there all night until my relief came. That morning, the first shift guard saw the look on my face and knew right away that I'd experienced something. He only nodded and said, "I know. This place scares me too." More recently, at the laser light show we have every July, my partner and I were watching the lights when we received a call over the radio about a suspicious person. We went to check it out, and it was a 15 to 16-year-old boy well away from the crowd at the beach watching the show. We asked him what was wrong, and he said, "Wow, a lot of people have died here. I can see them. The ones that drowned, and the one on the mountain. He's in gray, staring down. I get chills just thinking about it. We've had multiple drownings, and the gray figure he saw on the mountain we suspect to be a maintenance worker who wore gray jumpsuits and was killed by our mountain roller coaster called Boulder Dash a few years back." And then the kid said this, "It's time again. It'll happen soon." We all agree at the lake that every 2 years, something bad happens. A death, severe injury, etc. And we are long overdue. I work at a canned goods warehouse, on graveyard shifts some days, afternoon shifts on others. There are some creepy things that go on there, but what stands out to me is this one time I heard a blood-curdling scream. I swear to God that the scream belonged to a child. I've been around a lot of kids, and I've known a couple that would scream like that for fun. A single loud, drawn-out scream, distinct enough to know that it wasn't a fox or a coyote. Now, The warehouse is in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking in the middle of the country, about 15 or so miles away from civilization. I hear foxes and coyotes calling out there all the time, and they sound absolutely nothing like this. My blood ran cold, and I immediately called the police. I went into the company vehicle and started patrolling around the place. I couldn't quite pinpoint the sound because the place is a concrete jungle and there are dozens of trailers there, so the acoustics make it hard to pinpoint where any sound comes from. I looked between the trailers, in the empty ones, and found nothing. I drove over the curb and into one of the fields to do a quick check before the officers came. Nothing. 2 police cars showed up. It was 4 officers and a canine, and they asked me what had happened. They also asked what I heard and where the sound had come from. I told them as much as I could, and they went out into the fields and did a search while I patrolled the perimeter of the warehouse. After about an hour or so of searching, we met back at the guard shack. The cops said they couldn't find anything, but they gave me a direct number and told me to keep in touch if I were to hear or see anything. What I saw on the security cameras when I watched the footage sticks with me. Shortly before the time I heard the scream, which I documented to be at 3:15 in my shift and incident report, I saw a small shadow move in the very corner of one of the cameras. It was just right outside the blind spot, and sadly, there weren't any more angles that I could see. It could very well have been an animal, and the shadow wasn't enough to make certain of what it was. But this experience really stuck with me. I often wonder if what I saw on the camera and heard that night was a ghost, or if it genuinely was a lost girl or boy. I looked to see if there were any missing children in the nearby towns, and there weren't. My boss told me that I wasn't the only one who's heard a child scream, so I suppose that's something. There were even other reports of a child's laughter and tiny running footsteps in the trailer yard at various times of the day and night. Usually when the warehouse is closed and on breaks, when the trailer fetchers aren't moving trailers around, and when there are no trucks driving around the place. I worked security for a large global company for almost 10 years. During my tenure, there were multiple paranormal events that took place in the warehouses. Since many of the employees knew of my interest in the paranormal, they were comfortable enough to come to me whenever something strange happened to them. I gathered quite a collection of stories. There were 3 warehouses on our campus, so I'll identify them as warehouses A, B, and C. The first strange thing that I can recall taking place happened shortly after I started working 3rd shift in warehouse A. My partner and I were monitoring a room on the other side of the building via CCTV, as we suspected someone was taking naps there during their shift. Everything was going according to routine when we received an unrelated medical emergency call that forced us to stop surveillance for about an hour. After the emergency was over, we rewound the tapes to review the hour we had missed. We had 2 monitors, one with the live view of the room, and another with the taped view. About halfway through watching the tape, we saw the dark silhouette of somebody move across the doorway inside the room. We continued reviewing the tape and caught up to the point where we resumed live surveillance. No one had come out of the room, so whoever we saw walk past the doorway still had to be inside. As my partner kept an eye on the camera, I went back to physically check the room, expecting to find someone sleeping. There was no one there. I radioed my partner to ensure no one had exited while I was en route, and he confirmed that he hadn't observed anyone leave. I told him the room was empty, and chills went down my spine. I promptly left. When I got back to the command post, I offered him a chance to check things out, but he declined. We talked about that event for a long time, but didn't bring it up to management, since we were both new on the job. Years later, another employee told me she was always afraid of going into that room because it felt uneasy. Objects always seemed to move on their own at Warehouse C. One security officer had placed a pile of books on top of the command post desk and walked away briefly into the security office for a cup of coffee. When she returned, she found that her books had been moved to the opposite corner. She was the only person in the building. Another example of objects moving on their own came when I was making the rounds at Warehouse C one night. The maintenance guy came up to me and told me that I was pretty sneaky. I asked him what he meant, and he said about 30 minutes prior, while he was installing a shelf, he laid his screwdriver down to use another tool. About 10 seconds later, he reached for his screwdriver, but it had moved about 30 feet away. He said I was sneaky because he hadn't even noticed that I was there messing with him. I told him that I wasn't even in the warehouse 30 minutes ago. I'd been checking fire suppression equipment in the offices. He didn't believe me until I showed him the tape of me in the office at the time his screwdriver had moved. He got major goosebumps then. Finally, we had a covert camera set up in our high-value cage to watch for any potential thefts. You needed to swipe your ID badge to enter, and only certain people had access to the cage. The camera was set to record only when motion was detected to conserve space. The motion sensor, like the rest of them in the warehouse, was set to ignore anything under 50 pounds to prevent false recordings. We were reviewing the footage from the previous night, finding nothing interesting. The time skipped forward a few hours, as expected, from the time everyone went home that night to the people coming in for first shift. What we didn't expect was the several boxes in a bag that were in different positions. We couldn't believe it. If anyone had entered the aisle, the camera would have recorded them. We double-checked with the card access logs to confirm that no one had been in the cage between the time the camera stopped recording to when the boxes were moved. Warehouse C was by far the most haunted of the 3 warehouses where I worked. I began working in Warehouse C while it was still under construction. I spoke to some of the contractors who stated they were instructed to keep a lookout for skeletons and bone fragments and other relics, as a small cemetery was once located near the northeastern section of the property. I did some research and confirmed a cemetery that dated to 1803 had once occupied that section of land. There were several known burials, all of them young children, but records stated the cemetery had been removed. I was unable to find any other information as to where the graves were moved. The warehouse property was not built atop this section, but the company now owned that section of land. Once the construction was complete, the building sat empty for almost 2 years, while programmers worked on the software to run the building. Security, maintenance, and some IT guys were the only people in the building at that time. Almost every security officer who worked in Warehouse C had some sort of paranormal experience of their own. Some of them were even hardcore skeptics, until then. One of them was an older gentleman who had recently been hired to work the third shift. While I was training him, I brought up some of the stories others had told me about weird things they had experienced in the building, but he didn't believe a single word. About a month later, I was coming in on first shift to relieve him. He said that he now believed those stories. While walking out to his vehicle to grab his lunch, he had heard a female voice call from the smoker's patio, "Hey security, can you open this door for me?" He said, "Sure," thinking it was a lady from IT, and turned to unlock the door, but no one was there. That wasn't his only experience during his time there in security. We used to have huge sales at the building to get rid of overstock and return merchandise. One night, after one of these sales, this same gentleman was inspecting fire extinguishers when he heard a baby begin to cry from near a restroom area. Fearing someone had lost their child during the sale, he rushed over to the restroom. The crying stopped as he approached the restroom door. He checked both the men's and women's restrooms and a cleaning closet around the corner, but found nothing. He checked around the rest of the mezzanine, looking in every nook and cranny, but still found nothing. So he decided to finish up his inspections, and as he was checking the last extinguisher, the crying started coming from the restroom area again. He said that he returned to the command post as quickly as he could after that. These two events combined were enough for him to turn from a skeptic into a believer.